And when you say Casey Kasem, Britney Spears, Wendy Williams, all the famous people, realize we think there's as many as 2 million Americans guardianized right now, stripped of their civil rights. This is an issue that I think is the most under-discussed civil rights issue of our time. 2 million people, they can't vote, they can't marry, they can't sign a document, they can't decide where they're going to live, they can't spend their own money, they can't freely travel, they can't go to church or temple or a funeral or family wedding without the guardian's permission.
Yeah.
And if they have an unscrupulous guardian, then they're out of luck.
Good evening, everyone. I have the pleasure now of introducing Diane Dimond. Diane is an award-winning investigative journalist, author, syndicated columnist, television commentator, and she specializes in crime and justice topics. She's the author of 4 books: Be Careful Who You Love, Inside the Michael Jackson Case, Cirque du Salahi, Be Careful Who You Trust, and Thinking Outside the Crime and Justice Box. Now, her latest book is We're Here to Help: When Guardianship Goes Wrong. The book explores abusive and criminal conduct that has occurred within the nation's adult guardianship and conservatorship system. It's the culmination of more than 8 years of investigation, and it's a stark and quite frankly, very troubling look at a system that was designed to protect at-risk populations. And while it often does, too often, it has been abused by bad actors. And so I'll go start the conversation now. Welcome, everyone. So Diane, I wanted to start sort of at the beginning. One of the things that you talk about in your book and that you and I have spoken about is that this isn't a topic we hear about that often. So I thought it would be good to level set here and just ask you to describe for the audience, what is guardianship? Who is it meant to protect? And why are we discussing it today?
Well, we're discussing it because I wrote a book about it. But no, thanks for having me, first of all. But basically, you said it in the intro. Guardianship is a system that's active in every state in the union. It's administered by the courts, and it is designed to protect society's most vulnerable at-risk population. That sounds great. I mean, it's like a guardian angel. We give a needy person a guardian to make sure they live a safe and healthy, happy life. But my research, as you described, discovered that this protective system turns predatory way too often. It's ill-regulated. The court appointees are largely unsupervised in many cases. It's much more predatory than protective. And basically, it's because family members who petition the court to be the guardian for their loved one are ignored more and more by the court. A judge will find a reason that the family is not suitable or that member is not suitable and go instead with a professional, for-profit guardian, a stranger to the person who allegedly needs protection. It's sort of a recipe for disaster, Sarah, because the stranger has no idea what the at-risk person wanted out of life, what their hopes and dreams for the future, how they wanted to spend their money, and it often causes conflict with family members. Now, everyone needs to understand that a court-appointed guardian has enormous power. They are given enormous power by the court. And if they are unscrupulous, it becomes a nightmare for the family. And if the family complains about the guardian even has the power to ban them from seeing their loved one. I ran into many cases where caretaker daughters were refused the right to see their elderly mother who was dying, or an adult son to see his father. It's just heartbreaking, and there seems to be no recourse for family members. Now, you asked, who does this system called guardianship. By the way, it's called conservatorship in some
Yes, both.
states, like in California, where everyone has heard about the Britney Spears conservatorship that went on for almost 14 years. The program is designed to help these people, people with dementia or Alzheimer's, widows, widowers who don't have any family to take care of them, people with intellectual or some sort of disability, someone who's had a debilitating injury, a car accident, they're in a coma, or even people with long-term substance abuse or psychiatric issues.
Thank you for that introduction. In the book, you talk about a number of stories. You know, many in the audience may have heard you referenced the Britney Spears case, for example. People may have heard of the Wendy Williams case or Casey Kasem a number of years ago. And in the book, you tell stories about individuals, lesser known individuals who, may have been had diminished capacity in some manner, or their capacity was beginning to diminish. Family members were concerned, but things went wrong at some point in this system. And the public really is much less aware about these examples. So could you tell us maybe a little bit about one or two examples from your book, things that started off well-meaning, but took a turn in the wrong direction?
Oh, there's so many. There was a case of a young man in California who was profoundly disabled. And I know your work with disabled individuals, their parents or caretakers want the legal right, the guardianship to be able to take care of them. In this case, Mickey Paricio is his name. His parents became the guardians, and I don't mean to say that there aren't wonderful people working in the guardianship system and wonderful guardians, but this was the family became the guardians, the mother and father, and he was horribly abused.
Yeah.
They kept him in the house, unclothed, hosed him off in the backyard as a means of hygiene, and they did it because they got a lot of federal money, state money, nonprofit money to take care of him at home, but they didn't take care of him.
Yeah, and obviously, abuse happens in so many contexts, right? It happens inside of guardianship, it happens outside of guardianship, right? Why do you think it is that we're less aware, the public is less aware of this? I've often wondered that as a lawyer who works in this field. Right? People really don't know about it. What did you find about that?
So many people say to me, guardianship, what is it? Well, it's a mystery to most of us because it's really kind of a secret system. How come you don't know about it? Because oftentimes HIPAA laws are invoked, medical privacy. You can't come in the courtroom. You can't see the court case file. I'm going to, seal all the documents having to do with the case. Or a lot of times judges will invoke gag orders against the family. So they can't leave the courtroom and speak to anybody about the case. So this is why people don't know about the downside of guardianship. And when you say Casey Kasem, Britney Spears, Wendy Williams, all the famous people, realize we think there's as many as 2 million Americans guardianized right now, stripped of their civil rights. This is an issue that I think is the most under-discussed civil rights issue of our time. 2 million people, they can't vote, they can't marry, they can't sign a document, they can't decide where they're going to live, they can't spend their own money, they can't freely travel, they can't go to church or temple or a funeral or family wedding without the guardian's permission.
Yeah.
And if they have an unscrupulous guardian, then they're out of luck. And may I say, the common denominator with wards who are in abusive or financially exploitive guardianships is money.
Yeah.
They all seem to have very attractive assets. A house, a car, an art collection, a pension, an inheritance. They've won a big workman's compensation settlement. These are the people who fall prey to unscrupulous, predatory guardians over and over. Look, as a society, we want to take care of our vulnerable people, don't we? Of course we do. But if we were really serious about it, why don't all the people who are sleeping on the street here in Boston or New York or Los Angeles or Chicago or Baltimore or Dallas have a guardian because they don't have any money. That's why.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about assets and the financial piece of it, because I think it's so critical to your reporting in the book. I did want to sort of highlight another thing that you raise, and that resonated very much with me as a lawyer in this field, is that you said we think there are 1.5 to 2 million Americans currently living in this, under guardianship, and you talk about this in the book. There really are not any good, robust national statistics.
Yeah.
We're not keeping records.
There's no
about
database.
guardianship, and it's often said that you document the things that matter. Right? And this is an example of a system that is not documented. And perhaps one can ask, is it because as a society, we're not really focused on these individuals?
And we don't really understand how it all works. You know, we keep track of missing children and cars and buses and boats and motorcycles, but we don't keep track of the Americans who have been stripped of their civil rights and put under their entire life, all their life decisions put under the control of someone else. That's a shame. I quote several GAO reports going back years and years, saying to Congress, if you want to solve these problems, because they've lasted now for decades, you got to get your arms around the statistics. You got to get a national database.
Yes.
Just make every state count how many people are in guardianship, add it all up, and you got a database.
Yeah, this has been a recommendation, as you mentioned, for many, many years.
Yeah.
So getting back to the financial piece, because I really think that's the heart of so much of what you talk about in the book, are examples of, as you mentioned, individuals, maybe they're advancing in age and have dementia, and they have assets, and they become vulnerable to guardianship. And of course, we all know that financial predators exist in many contexts, right? The Bernie Madoffs of the world, or the email scams or the text scams that target elderly individuals with assets and so on. What makes guardianship a tool or a factor in this kind of financial exploitation?
Yeah, I like to call it a tempting lure. This is what does it. Collectively in the United States of America, state courts take control of wards' assets totaling $50 billion every year. $50 billion every year. Now, because we don't have specifics, I can't tell you exactly, but I believe that the average guardianship lasts about 6 years. $50 billion a year. That's a $300 billion pot of money just sitting there, waiting for other people to control it. Now, it might be a trusted family member, great. Might be a group of trustees that you've set up. But when it's a guardian, a stranger for-profit guardian, nobody's watching them. The judge appoints them, then he's got, 300 other cases to take care of. Guardians are supposed to, or conservators, as they're called, they're supposed to file at least an annual report of where did the ward's money go last year.
Right.
But they don't. They don't always. And when they do bother to put forward an accounting, there's nobody to check it.
Right. The courts may not have the resource to be following up.
Yeah.
And you detail in the book examples of, even you detail examples of just outright financial abuse and fraud and misappropriation of funds.
Yes.
But also, just lawyers charging their fees and the guardian charging their fees, and those fees add up to diminish the estate and the funding available to the person. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. That I should have mentioned that before. So you are made an incapacitated ward of the court. They take the control of all your assets, all of them, your house, your car, your money, your pension, your IRA, everything, and they put it in the name of whoever is appointed guardian. I hope I'm not getting too in the weeds here, but when that amount of money is under the control of a guardian who may not even be licensed to be a guardian. Only 3 states in the United States license them, California, Alaska, Nevada. They may not even have certification Most states don't even require certification. And what is that anyway? You take an online course for a few bucks and they send you a certificate. Hey, I'm a guardian. Great. So, in a system where we don't even background check, credit background, criminal background check people who are going to be guardians, there's going to be a problem. And when all the liquid money runs out, the ward's money is confiscated to pay for the ward's care, but the guardian decides how to spend it. And when all of the liquid money is gone, that being the checking account, the savings account, the guardian goes back to court and says, Your Honor, I have to sell their house and everything in it because I need money to take care of the ward. And the judge says, okay, you're already conscripted into guardianship. Now we got to pay for you. So they sell your house, your car, your everything. And what if that house was bequeathed to the caretaking daughter who's been taking care of mama? It's in the will. Well, too bad. The judges said okay. What if there's an irrevocable trust set up and the grandson's waiting for his college education money? Too bad. The judge has nullified those legal documents, your will, your irrevocable trust, your power of attorney erased, because now the guardian's in charge and the guardian decides everything.
In these cases that you describe, the focus ends up being so much on individuals who, where there may be disagreement in the family, right?
Yes.
It might start out because there's some, one child may say, I think mom needs to leave the house. I think we need to sell the house and get mom,
In a nursing home. Yeah.
And another sibling may say, no, I think mom told me she wants to stay in the house and wants to do this and that. And there's this real tug and pull. And sometimes the courts, in the absence of having a crystal ball, right, don't know who's right, what's right. They bring in a third party thinking that, this neutral person will be able to kind of resolve the conflict. And it sometimes goes very wrong.
Yes.
At the same time, there are so many individuals with very few assets, right? And the issues they have is there aren't enough resources to care for. That's the general problem, right? There's not enough resources to care for the person, and people turn to guardianship to try to access care, right?
Right.
And so when you talk about these cases involving individuals with assets, it's really one end of a spectrum, right?
Right. My work really concentrated on
Yeah.
those guardianships that became abusive
Right.
because a person had assets.
Exactly.
And there's all sorts of things on the spectrum, as you say.
Yeah.
Sometimes there is no money, and then you may have to turn to a public guardian where the state pays a
Right.
small amount to someone to come and help you.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
that's not what I focused upon. I focused upon the sheer predatory nature of what seems to me to be a growing cadre of collaborators. I'm talking guardians, conservators, the lawyers who file the original petitions, which, by the way, are full of lies and exaggerations, I found, and I outlined that in the book, designed to get the judge to say, oh my gosh, this family's dysfunctional. I have to get a for-profit stranger in here to deal with all this. So, there's a whole group of people on the inside of this, I call it an industry, that it's in their best interest to perpetuate and enlarge the ward pool. They don't make money if there's not wards coming in. And there's all sorts of things I outline in the book about how fully competent people are being conscripted into guardianship.
Yeah.
And that's the scariest part, because it's not just a family that can petition. Financial institutions, that's how Wendy Williams became into guardianship. Her Wells Fargo financial advisor decided she and her adult son weren't spending money properly, prudently. They got the guardianship ball rolling. Hospitals can get a guardianship petition going. Your angry next door neighbor, an estranged business partner, or your former lover, anybody can petition the court to guardianize another person. It's frightening.
You talk about a number of categories of individuals in your book. You talk about older people with dementia. You talk about individuals with developmental disabilities. One group that you talk about that was of particular interest to me as I was reading the book are women. And the interaction sometimes between divorce and guardianship
Oh, yes.
and elder financial abuse and women as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that
Yes.
connection.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up because that was one of the most startling things I think that I discovered. Divorce attorneys in several states, let me see if I can remember now, Ohio, New York, Connecticut, Florida, Pennsylvania, at least, and if I kept digging, I bet you I could find more divorce attorneys in more states, are telling their male clients, you know, your wife is being uncooperative in this divorce. Let's just guardianize her because then she can hire her own lawyer to fight you. This is one of the civil rights you lose in most states. I understand in Massachusetts they can hire their own attorney to fight for them, but in most states, if you're guardianized, you don't get to choose your own lawyer. I mean, somebody on death row has more rights than someone who is guardianized in some instances.
Opponents of guardianship refer to it as civil death. And there are
That's right.
people who believe it isn't appropriate in any circumstances. There are many people, of course, who use guardianship in care of a loved one to, as I mentioned, parents with caring for children or children caring for adults. It's so fascinating the disparate impact that you found in your reporting, I think,
Yes.
on women in particular, because we also know on the other end, women are a disproportionate percentage of the unpaid caregivers. So women are the petitioners too, most
Yes,
often.
yes.
I mean, in my own practice, anecdotally, I'd say 5 to 1. It was the mothers for their kids, the daughters for their mothers,
They're elderly mothers,
right? The
Yep.
sisters for the siblings. So this is a system that interacts in many unique ways, I think, around gender.
Not only can it, in some instances, victimize the ward, it victimizes the family members. You mentioned the elderly. So this is a montage I made of some of the people in my book. All of these, almost every single one, became guardianized because the family squabbled. The family couldn't figure out what to do with them, and one member said, I'm going to a lawyer, and I'm going to figure it out. Well, of course, that lawyer said, let's go for guardianship. And that's what happened. I'd like to talk about, let's see, I'll just pick one random. I think I'll talk about Doris Hamilton. She's right there, up in the top right corner. And get this, she has an only child. She is a educator in Las Cruces, New Mexico, the first Black school principal in that state, beloved in her community. Her son Rio and she went to a lawyer to talk about power of attorney, the will, what do we do? No contracts were signed, they just had a little consultation. Next thing they knew, the lawyer in Las Cruces, New Mexico, filed for guardianship of Doris Hamilton, saying that she worked for Rio Hamilton. Well, he split his time between New York and New Mexico. He had no idea. And all of a sudden, his mother is in guardianship, put into a nursing home where, by the way, Rio told me, when he would go to visit, she would be so over-medicated, they could not communicate. But you notice almost all of them are women. Now, I talk about many more cases in the book, but you look at this montage and almost all of them are women.
It's very interesting. You also talk about, of course, individuals with developmental or intellectual disabilities as well. And you referenced at the beginning of our conversation one of the most horrific examples in the book of the young man who was abused by his parents. But if you could talk about an example or two of that, I know.
Yeah, and in the Mickey Parisio case, his brother kept going to the authorities and saying, please help, take him away from my parents. And the judge had nowhere, he said he had nowhere to put him, so he stayed put and he died at home. So these are people with disability who are in my book. And I wish I could tell you all about every single one of them because their stories are so compelling. This woman's guardian allowed her to nearly starve to death. in New York City. Someone intervened. She was saved for a few months, but she died because of it. This is the one I'd like to tell you about. This is Michael Ligori. At birth, there was an accident. He was deprived of oxygen, and he developed a mild case of cerebral palsy. His parents won a $1.9 million settlement, medical malpractice, and because he was an infant, the law said you have to have a guardian. Okay, at 18, Michael, a stellar high school student, by the way, you know, cerebral palsy affects your motor skills, not your intellect.
Yeah.
He wants his money. He wants to use some to go to college. His guardian went back to the judge in Staten Island, New York, and said, in effect, without talking to Michael or his family, you know, he walks funny, he talks funny, he can't manage his own money. And the judge said, okay. And so for 6 more years, Michael Ligori was put in the position of watching his money go to the guardian and the conservator and the court visitor and the mental health evaluator. He called me right before Christmas last year and he said, Diane, I'm finally out. He was so happy. And I said, Michael, how much money do you have left? He said, I don't know. There's no way to tell because the guardian did not file for years and years, did not file my annual accounting. And by the way, to get out of guardianship, Michael had to agree to pay an additional $100,000 in outstanding fees, they called it, to all of the court appointees. So that's what can happen.
You also talk about individuals who are like Michael, you know, other individuals who don't necessarily have other disabilities. They're fully competent, and they get swept up in this too. And before you start, just to, you know, one thing that struck me as I was reading this piece, and particularly Michael's story, is I think some of this, we can talk about it, you know, has to do with the law and the way the law is meted out. But some of it also, I think, has to do with the way we view individuals with disability in the US and globally to a certain extent. And the fact that someone with cerebral palsy may be assumed or presumed to lack capacity, or their voice isn't heard or taken seriously, or someone with a mental health issue, you know, may be cast aside as not reliable when they raise a concern or whatever. I think that's a big part of what ends up happening in these situations is the culture around disability, I think.
You know, one of the most heartwarming stories I read was about this woman right here. That's Jenny Hatch.
Oh, yeah.
And Jenny Hatch is, well, I don't want to give away the whole story. Read the book. But Jenny Hatch was consumed with the fact that she was normal. And she wanted a job, and she wanted to live her life. There was strife in her family. They wanted to be more protective. But Jenny Hatch spawned a movement called supported decision-making. She had a wonderful lawyer, who I quote in the book, who took up her fight and said, she does not need a guardian anymore. She is an adult. She works. She gets herself to work and back. She's politically active. She was very athletic. Drove her bike all around. She had an accident and was smart enough to know what kind of surgery she needed. Get her out of guardianship. And the supported decision-making idea was born, which is much less restrictive than guardianship.
Sure.
And now some people have problems with it too, because it brings in other people, but sometimes people need other people to help them.
I'm so glad you mentioned supported decision-making. For those in the audience and online, there has been legislation in front of the Massachusetts State Legislature to legally recognize supported decision-making as an alternative to guardianship. In Massachusetts, it's recognized in a number of states, as you write in the book, and in countries all over the world, as a way that individuals can make decisions, keep their right to make decisions, and bring in supporters of their choosing to help them do that. Just like we all make decisions, right?
Yes, I don't know what to do with my car. I ask my mechanic. You know, I don't know what to do with my hurting tooth. I ask the dentist.
Right.
The problem is, I don't want to burst your bubble on supported decision-making, but even if it's on the books, the judges are the ones who decide guardianship or supported decision-making. Supported decision-making is a little more complicated. Guardianship is easy. Boom, I sign the petition, you're in guardianship.
And
So it's still up to the judge.
you mention in the book your conversation with a lawyer who I think rightly and smartly made the observation that it isn't just about law reform. Law reform is important, but it's about then following the law, right? The
Yes.
lawyers, the judges, the guardians, and that gets back to the culture that we were just talking about, right? We all have these preconceived notions, and I think the instinct to be very paternalistic sometimes wins out over respecting people's will and preference. So maybe we could talk a little bit about some of those examples of individuals who got wrapped up in this almost seemingly randomly.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
These are more people whose stories I discuss in my book. The top 4, you notice they're all women, by the way. The top 4, I go into their cases in detail. Teresa Jankowski with the Roses worked for the FBI her entire life, wanted to leave money to a dog charity because she was a single woman. And her Wells Fargo financial advisor, sounds familiar, got her on the guardianship path. That's Joanne Bashinsky in the aqua-colored blouse there. She had a huge estate. She was called the potato chip queen down in Alabama. And her bookkeeper and a lawyer, she thought she trusted them, went for guardianship of her because they didn't like the way she was giving away her money. She fought it and won in the Supreme Court of Alabama, and she died 6 months later. So she was robbed of her final years just fighting it. This is Dr. Lily White. She's from Palm Coast, Florida. An estranged granddaughter. Her son had an illegitimate daughter. Years later, this young woman who lives in a completely different state was told, you know, if you guardianize her, you can get your hands on some of her money. Well, she had $5 million, and it worked. And Dr. Lily White died of COVID in a nursing home, and her family had no idea where she was. Why? Because the guardian didn't have to tell them and wouldn't tell them where she was. And that's Susan Terranova there. She was a lawyer for the government. In the end, it was the Homeland Security Department. She had a little bit of memory loss, and her brother down in Alabama came and picked her up, took her back to Alabama, guardianized her, put her in a nursing home, and she remains there to this day. She was a single woman, had a dream. She had just retired, couldn't fulfill the dream because she's under guardianship in a state where she didn't want to be, with a brother she didn't want to be even near. But I want to talk about this woman here. This is Paulette Kohler, and this is a story that's just come to me recently. Paulette is 93 years old, lives in the same Manhattan Upper West Side apartment for 50 plus years. Her husband died, her only child died, and her best friend in the world is this woman, Inga Egerud, on the left. She's from Norway. Paulette is originally from France. They're so close that Paulette made Inga the power of attorney. Well, Paulette went to the hospital for a little minor surgery and woke up to find she was in guardianship. Well, who had put her in guardianship? It was the landlord of her apartment building. What? Well, in my opinion, the landlord wanted control of her rent subsidized apartment so he could flip it and sell it for millions. When this started, her net worth was right there, $870,000. In just 18 months, the guardian spent $720,000. Where did it go? Nobody knows. There was no accounting. Now, there was a group of benevolent supporters that got Paulette out of guardianship, but she was robbed of those 18 months of her life. And now, I must say, there is a civil suit pending, and I have been tapped to be an expert witness in this trial and have filed a report with the court. But this is the kind of thing that can happen to people. This is the feistiest woman you'd ever want to talk to. She's totally competent. She was at the time, but it took a toll on her. And is she competent now? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not qualified to say that.
So maybe this is a good time to transition to my last question before we take audience questions.
Sure.
And that is, what do you, based on your reporting, what do you think people should do or plan, maybe to avoid the need for guardianship or the prospect of guardianship in their lives? I mean, I think any lawyer would agree that guardianship is a last resort. Even when it works well and it is necessary, it is a last resort. And ideally, one can and should avoid it. So,
Well, I'm not sure every lawyer thinks that, especially those who write the guardianship petitions, but I'll give you that.
Touche. Many.
So what can you do to protect yourself? I talked about how a judge can nullify your power of attorney, your will, your healthcare proxy, all of those things, but do them anyway. Get them anyway. Get them in place. My daughter is way younger than me. We won't go into exact ages, but she should already have it in place. You're 21 years old, 25 years old, 30 years old. Get it in place. You never know what can happen. I just got a fabulous estate attorney who inserted into my power of attorney specific language. And it's, complicated, your legalese, how you do it. But the bottom line is, it says to any judge who might be considering guardianship for me or my husband, that you may only appoint a guardian from my beneficiary list. My daughter, one of my 3 grandchildren, my husband. That's it. Now, can a judge ignore it? Yeah. Yeah, he can. But that would be a heck of an appeal point, I would think.
You also mention in your book, and it's worth mentioning here, one of the things that sometimes happens is people do estate plans, or they have powers of attorney, or they have healthcare proxies, and they squirrel them away in a safe deposit box somewhere, and nobody ever knows they're there. So it's really important that when people do this kind of estate planning, they talk about it.
Yes.
They share it with the individuals in their lives. They have copies of it. The conversations can be uncomfortable, but better to have them at that point than to wait.
Yeah. I recommend, number one, if your family squabbles, go to mediation first. Don't go to a lawyer. That's way cheaper. But also have a family meeting, sit down with everybody.
You're going to get a legal job again after this.
I'm sorry. You lawyers have plenty of work, I'm sure. But have a family meeting and tell your family, you don't have to mention dollar figures, but tell them what's in your estate. And I would add, let it be known, anybody who goes against your wishes is completely disinherited, no questions asked. You'd be surprised how that stops the fighting.
And of course, as the lawyer here, I always should say, consult with a lawyer and let them give you the advice that is specific to your situation.
And I consulted with a lawyer too. You're a necessary evil in our lives, unfortunately.
Oh dear. This started out so nicely, Diane. This is a good time, I think, to begin to bring in audience questions.
Let's bring in the Zoom question.
Diane, thank you so much. We have a very robust Zoom audience, and we have a lot of questions.
Okay.
Let me start off with a comment from Rosalind. Thank you so much for hosting this session. We need more to raise awareness across the nation. Big thanks to you, Diane, for your transparency, advocacy, and courage. Being a victim fighting for my mom, I am grateful for you.
Oh. That touches my heart. Thank you.
What about the judges? There would be no guardianship if the judge did not allow it. The problem is the judges.
Hello, Zoom audience. They always ask great questions. This is the nail being hit right on the head. Guardianships cannot occur until a judge agrees, and a judge lets them continue even when the family complains or shows evidence or says, please, let me see my mother again, or whatever. And a judge could stop a guardianship if, in fact, a fully competent person comes up and says, what am I doing here? Judges often, and again, I wish I could give you percentages, but I can't. Judges often sign a guardianship petition without ever seeing the targeted person. without ever talking to the family. This is outrageous that my daughter said to me today, if the judges were just made to talk to the family, just spend a couple of hours with the family, listening to what's going on and talking to the person, we might have fewer guardianships. I agree. I also had someone recommend to me, how about making the judge go into guardianship themselves for a month? See what it's like. See what it's like to suddenly be taken out of your home and put into a nursing home and overdosed with pills to make you compliant. That's never going to happen. But I do think, to the question, judges need to be more fully educated, more fully funded so they have more staff, and the court system needs to grow with the aging population. We have drug courts, we have veterans courts. We need to have a guardianship court in this country, I think.
Yeah.
You know, one thing I'll just say is one of the challenges in the court system is that the docket grows exponentially because people are in the guardianships and then you get new petitions year after year after year. And these courts are being crushed.
Yes.
And they don't have the time and they don't know when two family members are arguing which one is telling the truth.
Right.
And so, you know, it's not, you know, the case that, you know, I mean, you do cite cases of judges who've, you know, who were malevolent actors in the system, but the overwhelming issue is that they don't have the resources or the
The
time.
volume.
And we don't have really solid alternatives in place, like supported decision making and so on and so forth. And so I think, so I think it's a legal issue. I think it's a resource issue. I think we need better data collection, just as you say. I think that's critically important.
So we have a question from an in-audience member.
And you just mentioned supported decision making, and I'm just curious in terms of alternatives to guardianship, how supported decision making actually works, and whether it's less of a burden on the court system, more of a burden, sort of the intricacies of that.
That's a great question, and you can add to this. Supported decision-making lets the person, like Jenny Hatch, that I told you, she had Down syndrome, decide who they want to rely on in their lives. Now, some state proposals have staff that will come and be one of those people. I think it's an excellent idea. It takes the profit motive out because the people that she is or he is conferring with before making a decision aren't paid. They're volunteers, they're friends, they're families, or maybe getting a small stipend from the state. I think the problem with guardianship today is the profit motive.
And the issue is when you have one person with so much authority and very little oversight.
Right.
One of the arguments in favor of supported decision making is a group of people. You know, it's sort of like, you know, when my baby was an infant, I preferred a daycare center because I knew there would be many people there rather than just one person, right?
Right.
The other thing about supported decision making, you asked specifically how it helps with the courts. In many places, like Massachusetts, if this, if we pass this bill, is it either can be brought up in the context of if somebody petitions for a guardianship, they will consider supported decision making as an alternative before approving that guardianship. But a supported decision making agreement can and actually ideally would be drafted totally outside of the court system. So you wouldn't need to go to court. It would be like a healthcare proxy or a durable power of attorney or any legal document that you draft and that is operable because we have laws that recognize it and allow people to rely on
But
it.
you'd still need a lawyer to draw up that agreement, wouldn't you?
Well, that's very interesting. There's a movement to have very accessible and people with disability-led processes to do supported decision-making. So there's actually some supported decision-making agreements that are done, you know, in consultation with lawyers, but a lot of involvements from the community with disability. But as attorneys, as an attorney, I think it is helpful also to have the advice of
And
an attorney.
I'll just add, in New York State, where I live, there is a program, it's cumbersome. It is a cumbersome program, but there's a program to keep an elderly Alzheimer's patient, for example, at home, and the state will pay you to keep that person at home rather than burden the nursing home or burden the hospitals or like that. So, things are evolving, but they're way too slow. I mean, I write in the book, where did all this start? It started with the Osage Indian tribe, killers of the flower moon.
Yeah.
It started
gonna ask you
in the
about that.
1900s when the Osage Indians made so much money. Congress decided they're not spending their money prudently, and they developed this thing called guardianship, and all these white guys went out to Oklahoma and became the guardians of the entire tribe. So, when are we going to figure this out? When are the lobbyists from the legal community, the guardianship community, the nursing home community, the hospital community, when are those lobbyists going to stop telling lawmakers, we're here to help? We're just here to help. It's those dysfunctional family members. They're the problem. The system is fine. Well, the system is not fine. What did Judge Brandeis say? If you want people to have respect for the law, you have to make the law respectable. Well, the law in this instance is not respectable.
We have another series of questions from the Zoom audience around accountability for guardians who misuse funds. So, what does the judge do? How do we hold guardians accountable? So, you've shared numbers and figures, $700,000 plus. Funds used. What kind of accountability measures you talk about in some cases?
I'm still waiting to see what happens to that guardian because there's a civil suit pending, but that's such a good question. Accountability, what usually happens? Nothing. Nothing. That said, and guardians get away with so many dirty tactics, which I describe in the book. They go to sell a Ward's house for $400,000, they write on the audit that maybe nobody even looks at, but they really sold it for $500,000. And they sold it in conjunction with a colleague in the real estate industry. And what happened to that other 100,000? Well, what do you think? Nobody checks. So having said all of that, and I describe more of their tactics in the book, there are guardians that are being held accountable now. I believe on our Zoom call right now, there's a lady from Nevada who will be jumping up and down when I mention April Parks, a guardian there, who was sentenced to up to 47 years in prison for what she did to her wards. Conversely, there's a guardian in Florida who, believe this, I swear it's true, she had 400 wards all at the same time. Now, how could she be protecting 400 wards in various counties? She put do not resuscitate orders on every one of them. And one of them died because she also capped his feeding tube. She just willy-nilly decided to cap his feeding tube, and he died. What happened to that guardian? Almost nothing. She got 4 years probation. She's not allowed to be a guardian in Florida anymore, but now she's a registered life coach. And I tell the story about Rebecca Farrelly in the book in a very extensive way. I go back several years to tell you what she did to guardians. So what happens to guardians if they're not stopped by the judge? If the judge won't listen to the family complaints, they just do pretty much whatever they want. And it pains me to say that, but that's what happens.
Let me ask another Zoom question, and I'm going to go back to the in-person audience. So I think this is from a lawyer. Comment to consider. SDM is not only a matter of state law. US HHS's final section 504 rulemaking expressly recognizes SDM as an example of a reasonable modification in policies, practices, or procedures that may be necessary to avoid unlawful disability-based discrimination under federal law.
Okay,
But
I can.
the judge may consider supported decision-making. That doesn't mean they're going to choose
Okay.
that.
So I think the point, and thank you to whoever wrote that in.
This is Morgan.
Okay. I know Morgan. Thanks, Morgan. So I think what Morgan was trying to point out is that I may have left the impression that unless and until that legislation is passed, supported decision-making isn't available. And Morgan is exactly right, it is. Everyone has the right to create a supported decision-making agreement, including individuals with disabilities, and it is an accommodation. Supported decision-making, help making decisions is a recognized accommodation. We're looking for legislation in Massachusetts so that providers, doctors, banks, others are familiar with this tool and feel they can rely on the decisions being made using the tool, and also so that the courts can rely on the tool as an alternate when they see a petition for guardianship. But it is absolutely the case, unless and until, I say this all the time, and unless and until a judge has adjudicated somebody incapacitated, they have the right to make their
And before I turn the mic over, this goes to the issue of judges' accountability. So we talked about guardianship accountability, quite a number of questions in the chat, in the Q&A related to judge accountability. So this question, what happens to the judges that allowed the guardians to get away with this behavior? Probably nothing. This is the problem. What happened to the judge who enabled April Parks?
right.
Oh, he was moved over to family court. He wasn't fired. He was moved to family court. So what happens to the judges? Look, like someone complains to the judge, I want to complain to you, Your Honor, about the person that you appointed to be the guardian. Well, how often do you think the judge rules against his own appointee? Like zero. So what happens with a judge who has been uncompassionate or allowed irregularities or crimes to occur? Nothing. They have judicial immunity. You could speak to this more than I can, but decisions made from the bench are not prosecutable. So sorry, family. Sorry, ward, who is in guardianship and you're fully competent. The judge has ruled and that's it. This is a court that goes under equity court rules. This isn't like civil court or criminal court rules. Equity court rules are different in that the judge can pretty much do whatever they want. I mean, of course, it's still a court of law, but it's a different set of rules. And whoever asked that question, thank you for it, but don't hold your breath that a judge is ever going to be held accountable. Now, I will tell you, there's one judge in Florida that I'm keeping my eye on who has people come before him that he guardianizes. Then when it comes time that, well, Your Honor, we have to sell the house, the judge is buying the houses at a way depressed rate. And then, I have spreadsheets to prove this, he sells it for a lot of money a few months or a year later. He has 60 such properties. What happened to this judge? He was just elevated to a higher court by Governor Ron DeSantis. So what will happen to him? The FBI is investigating. Maybe there's another book in this.
Yeah, I don't mean to be like flip about this, but how does one get started in the guardianship business? Like I'm thinking about the woman who had 400 wards. Like who are these people who are appointed by the courts, and how can you be in that position?
That's such a good question. Listen, again, there are some really good, compassionate, dedicated people who work in this system as guardians and conservators. How do you get to be a guardian? Well, in most states, you have to be 18 years old and a high school graduate. You don't have to have any special education in finance, elder care, family dynamics, no medical background. You don't have to have any of that. I spell out in the book some jaw-dropping people who became guardians. There was a taxi cab driver who became guardian for an 84-year-old man who had some money, not a lot, but he had some money. I found this in a GAO report. And he took the old man into his basement, put a dirty T-shirt and a diaper on him, and spent all of the man's money at buying a Hummer and going to Hooters. So what was his qualification? He was a cab driver. I found a car mechanic in the state of Texas who was owed some money by a wealthy local man in this small town in Texas. He'd done a bunch of work on classic cars for him and was owed about 40 grand. Went to a lawyer and he said, what do I do to be paid for all of this work? And the lawyer said, go for guardianship. So this car mechanic became the guardian for a multi-millionaire older man in Texas who had forgotten to pay his bill. My point is, it can be anybody. Anybody can become a guardian. If you really want to be respected in the field, you need to get licensed or you need to be certified. You can become a master guardian. And these guardians realize they can charge up to $600 an hour. And they can hire on as many other people as they see fit to service the ward. So they hire cooks and cleaners and personal shoppers and drivers and pooper scooper uppers for the dog and somebody to clean the swimming pool that nobody swims in anymore. And there's nothing to stop those guardians from hiring their own family and their own friends to these positions. So you want to be a guardian? Just get online. You can take a couple of courses on video and they'll send you a certificate.
So Diane, I'm going to ask you one final question from Zoom, and then I have my own final question for you. Unfortunately, we have 31 more questions in the Q&A box that we haven't gotten to, but we've gotten to a fair amount. One person asks, what do you recommend a single woman with no husband or children do to protect herself? So you talked a little bit, but can you speak to this woman who's asked this question?
I wonder, that's such a poignant question. I have a girlfriend who asked me that very same thing. She lives in Pennsylvania, and that is a particularly problematic state for guardianship. And I told her, you have to get some documents in order, and you have to find someone in your life that you trust enough to be your power of attorney or to make healthcare decisions for you when you are sick in the hospital and you have no one else. You need to make a plan, because if you don't make a plan, the court will make a plan for you. And that can be devastating. So that's not an adequate answer, but that's the only answer I have. Maybe, have you got an idea?
I think consent is going to, stereotypical, but consulting with a lawyer on an estate plan is exactly
Yes.
the right thing.
Yeah.
Including, healthcare proxy, durable power of attorney, all those kinds of documents. Yeah.
Yep. Anyone else want to offer any advice? I knew you might have something to say, Peter.
As far as solutions, I understand you say people need to be proactive, et cetera. But I wonder, is there any big picture solution? Is there statutes? Is there laws? Anything that we could change? It doesn't. And when I ask that, I'm kind of pessimistic about it, because ultimately, sooner or later, you go in front of a judge. It's a lawyer arguing in front of the judge, and then the judge makes a decision. And I'm just wondering, is there any way that you really change the law? And because every solution I'm thinking of, well, they get everybody certified, but you're right, they certify you, so you take a course and they give you the certificate. And so is there any kind of big picture solution there?
Boy, I'm glad you asked that. Look, I've been looking at this for a decade now. Took me 8 years before I wrote the book, and now it's been a couple more years since the book finally came out. And I think the states have proven that they are bad actors in this system. And I think it's time the federal government stepped in. Congress has hearings on this issue. They had hearings back in 1987 on this issue. Everybody says it's terrible what happens, and nothing gets done. The states are not handling it, so I think it's time for the federal government to step in and do something. First of all, get a damn database, and let's figure out how big this problem. Let's get our arms around this problem. Now, people on Capitol Hill, I used to cover Capitol Hill as a reporter, they'll tell you, well, no, this is a states' rights issue. Well, I'm going to call BS on that, because when this is a civil rights issue, in my mind. And when the Department of Justice thinks there's a civil rights issue in a local police department in some state, they go in to that police department and they regulate it. Why can't they do that with the guardianship industry? I call it an industry. I also call it a racket. I think it's become almost like organized crime. These cadres of insiders that nobody tells the secret of what's going on that case or that case. And so I think there has to be some federal regulation, some federal law about guardianship. We have an American with Disabilities Act. Why don't we have a Guardianship Act? Why don't, I'm not smart enough to write the legislation or even suggest it, but I know the states aren't doing the job. And I think the only solution is for the feds to step in.
So Diane, that was actually the question I was going to ask you.
Sorry.
What gives you hope?
What gives me hope? Symposiums like this, educating the public about, if you're in a family squabble and you can't decide what to do with your disabled brother or elderly parent, don't fight about it. The person who's going to get hurt the most is a person you say you love. You're at-risk person. What gives me hope is educating the public and letting the bad actors inside this system know we're watching you. We know what's happening. Guardians are now being convicted and at a pretty nice clip. I've been pretty happy with it, although it needs to speed up considerably. So it gives me hope that the predators are going to be brought to justice and that somehow this system's going to change. If we can get past all the politics going on the airways and in the newspapers these days and talk about these human issues, civil rights issues, I think maybe something could get done. Am I holding my breath? No.
And Sarah, you've been in this guardian space for over 15 years. What gives you hope?
I've been in a really different piece of it, right? So I've predominantly represented low-income clients. The primary challenges they face are not enough services. These are, parents who've been clawing for services for their kids with intellectual development, mental disabilities, or people who are aging and have no resources.
Mm-hmm.
I view this as really part of a much larger problem with the resources we have available, the commitment we have as a society to
Yes.
provide support to people. The 90% don't have too many resources; they have too few, and that's the piece that I see. And I would just say one thing that gives me hope is there is a growing recognition that people with lived experience, people with disabilities need to be at the forefront of the conversation and driving some of this change. And there are discussions around supported decision-making, there are discussions around opportunities to give people a voice. Because when you talked about data collection, when you talked about we don't know, I mean, when people are silenced or they're not counted,
Mm-hmm.
it's really easy to let things slide. But when we have data, when we recognize people, when we give them a voice, that's when I think we begin to see change.